Anti-government forces in northwest Syria launched their biggest offensive in years. The fighting is the most intense since the height of the war almost a decade ago. So why has the violence flared up again, and why now? Could it escalate? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Anti-government forces have overrun chunks of territory in Syria's northwest in the first major outbreak of fighting in recent years. Syrian and Russian warplanes have been scrambled to try and push back the offensive. It's the biggest attack since March 2020. That's when Russia, which backs President Bashar al-Assad, and Turkey, which supports some of the rebel groups, brokered a ceasefire. The flare-up is happening as Iran and Hezbollah, allies of Assad, have been weakened by Israel in fighting in Lebanon. So why has the conflict started again now, and what might be its impact on the 5 million people living in opposition-controlled areas? We'll discuss all this and more with our guests. But first, this report from Axel Zamovic.
The sounds of war have returned to Idlib and Aleppo as armed groups mount their most ambitious offensive in years. In a surprise attack on Wednesday, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a group formerly affiliated with the al-Nusra Front, captured dozens of villages. The fighters say their offensive is a response to recent attacks by the army. They're now advancing on the outskirts of government-controlled Aleppo.
Know that life changes swiftly and the balance of power has shifted towards us in a way we never expected. We are stronger than the world thinks, stronger with God first and with you second. The promise is near, so do not leave your positions.
The war in Syria began in 2011 when the Assad regime crushed pro-democracy protests during the Arab Spring. What started as a popular uprising evolved into a complex proxy conflict involving regional and world powers. Years later, Syria's north remains deeply fragmented. The northwest, where the fighting is taking place, is the last stronghold of rebel groups and their allies. To the east, Kurdish forces backed by U.S. troops control territory rich in oil and gas, while Turkey maintains buffer zones along its border. And the Assad government controls 2/3 of the country, with support from Iran and Russia. The Syrian army responded to Wednesday's incursions with intensive airstrikes, hoping to halt the fighters' advance. Opposition groups say Russian aircraft were involved. The military says armed groups have targeted villages, towns, and military installations. But the timing of the operation is raising questions. Assad's key allies, Iran and Hezbollah, are under attack from Israel, which is backed by the United States. And Russia is waging war in Ukraine. But some insist the new fighting is not related to events outside the country.
The Syrian regime, every now and then, sometimes directly by its forces, sometimes by its allies, Iranian and Russian, shell the people, absolutely for no reason. So this operation is both defensive and offensive.
Nearly 3 million displaced people live in northwest Syria, and the renewed fighting could worsen a growing humanitarian crisis there. Recent months have seen Arab states and Turkey moving to normalize relations with Assad, despite concerns from those living in the rebel-held north. After 13 years of war that's claimed more than 300,000 lives and displaced 12 million people, this new offensive threatens to unravel the fragile stability of recent years. Axel Zamovic, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., we're joined by Qutaiba Idlbi. He's a senior policy advisor at the American Coalition for Syria, which supports US policy based on democratic reform and human rights in Syria. In Ankara, in Turkey, we have Omer Ozkizilcik, the director of Turkish Studies at the Omran Diraset Research Organisation and a non-resident fellow for the Syria Project at the Atlantic Council. And also in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Caroline Rose, the director at the New Lines Institute, non-partisan think tank, where she heads research on military withdrawal and security. Welcome to you all. I'll begin with you, Qutaiba, if I may. Why has this started now? What are the rebel factions? What has made them start this offensive now?
Thank you so much. There are, of course, a couple of reasons why this is now. I think to start with first, there's a logistical and very pressing reason, which is related to the lives of almost 4 million civilians living in the areas of Western Aleppo and Idlib today. For almost 4 years, those populations have been living under the mercy of the government forces and Iranian militias, bombarding those villages and towns on a daily basis because they do control the strategic hills overseeing those different towns and villages. So there was definitely a need to liberate hills and areas that oversee those areas that would prevent the Assad regime from using artillery and rockets to target areas, different towns and cities of Idlib and Western Aleppo. I think geopolitically also what's happening in the region, especially in Lebanon, with the weakening of Hezbollah and Iran across different areas of Syria, has really presented an opportunity for the rebels to really try to advance and test the weaknesses of the Assad regime and its allies of the Iranian militias. The preparations, of course, for this operation has been going on for months. So there has definitely at least thoughts about this and plans to do this for a long time. But of course, the timing of the operation 3 days ago, I think, has come as a surprise to all of us.
Omer, is that what it is? The anti-government forces in northwestern Syria taking advantage of what's happened to Hezbollah and Iran in Lebanon?
Yes, that is quite true. And the Syrian rebels have taken advantage of this. But this is not all of the story. There's also the story between Ankara and Damascus. So Ankara has tried to reach out to Damascus and tried a normalization approach with the Assad regime. However, that failed. And the Russians recently declared Turkey as an invading force in Syria and stated that there's no hopes for a presidential meeting. And despite several Turkish overtures, the regime in Damascus was not ready to discuss a political solution in Syria. And thus, the operation, as it was discussed for months now, was initially rejected by Turkey. And now we see that Turkey has given the green light for this operation to be launched. And we see that due to the war in Ukraine and due to the tension between Israel and Iran, the two main backers of the Assad regime, Iran and Russia, are not capable of prepping up their Syrian partner, and they cannot protect the Assad regime. And the Assad regime, without massive support from Iran and Russia, is apparently not able to withhold against the Syrian rebels, because the current collapse of the defensive lines of the Assad regime is a surprise to all, and I think also a surprise to the Syrian rebels themselves.
Caroline, I see you nodding away there. Omer saying this is because the Assad regime has not reacted to overtures from Turkey. So Turkey has given the green light for this. Is that what you think?
I think Turkey has certainly indirectly given the green light, because this is ultimately an opportunity for them to redraw the lines of the conflict, particularly this ceasefire agreement that has been in place since really 2019, 2020. But additionally, as Omer just mentioned, it's also an opportunity for them to remold talks for normalization with the regime. Also, of course, this is an opportunity for them post-ceasefire that has been made in Lebanon just a few days ago, for them to also try and redraw and redesign the lines of the geopolitical context and dynamic of the region before the Trump administration takes office. Ultimately, because Turkey's also looking at the northeast of Syria, where the United States has about 900 personnel, active duty personnel stationed, in addition to contractors fighting alongside the SDF. So really, I think for them, they're thinking about the long game, the big picture, which is how can we really try and change the lines and change the rules of conflict in north of Syria.
OK, we'll get back to the politics a little bit later. But Qutaiba, in terms of the practicalities on the ground, when we talk about the different rebel groups, the different anti-government forces that there are in the north and the northwest of Syria, who's leading this offensive?
So the different groups on the ground have established what is so-called the military management unit, where basically the leaders from the different groups are coming together to manage this operation. Of course, the training and preparation for this operation has started at least 5 or 6 months ago, where centrally all different groups have sent different numbers of fighters to train in different areas of Idlib. Actually, many fighters were turned back because for the leadership, they thought they were not ready enough for the level of this operation. But it seems there is a kind of like a more joint effort to push forward on this. There is clearly a joint effort to make sure that there is no branding for any specific group to take lead or to say that they are the ones who are advancing on the ground. So there is high level of coordination that we haven't seen in years when it comes to rebel advances on different fronts against the regime. Of course, there is no doubt there is an important role for Hayat Tahrir Sham to play in this as one of the main groups that has remained a command and control structure across northwest Syria. But I wouldn't, doubt the role that other groups, including groups that have been supported by the United States before, like Faylaq al-Sham, like Jaysh al-Azzay, like Al-Jabha al-Shamiyya, all of those are importing very vital role in this operation that we see today.
Omer, there is plenty that divides these groups, these rebel groups in Syria, but they are united in their opposition to Assad. It seems quite well coordinated, as Qutaiba's just saying, but can they hold the gains that they've made, you think, and that they're making?
So when it comes to holding the gains, I think the opposition has a favorable position here because it's much easier for them to hold positions rather than capturing positions. And we have to see how the Assad regime will work, especially if the rebels succeed in fully gaining control over all of Aleppo city. It will be really hard for the Assad regime to capture the city back. As you may remember, in 2016, when Assad managed to take the city back, it was only due to heavy investments and heavy air support by the Russians and Iranians. So, and I doubt that Russia and Iran, after the invasion of Ukraine and after the tensions in Lebanon and the Israeli-Iranian tensions, have the resources to step again and the Assad regime for a retake of Aleppo city. And it appears that the momentum is on the side of Syrian rebels, and we may speak about Syria in a much different perspective than we did last week.
Caroline, that's it, isn't it? It's the first serious challenge to Assad and his backers in years. I mean, how much of a threat do you see this as being to him?
I mean, if you look at just the impressive scale and the pace of this operation, and I don't want to speak for Qutaiba and Omer, but I think that potentially we can all agree that this is quite impressive when it comes to just how fast they were able to push not only to the outskirts of Aleppo, but to Aleppo city. This was just within 3 days, and they were able to retake territory that for Iran-aligned militias, for the regime itself, for Russian forces that were backing those forces, it took them months, if not years, to try and sustain those sorts of operational gains. Combined with the fact that this really had excellent operational security, this was very much an impressive operation. And I think now, of course, the question is, can they sustain that? And can the regime try and build up momentum? I think it all comes down to the fact and really the question of whether Russia will be able to increase its assistance to the Syrian regime, in addition to Iran-aligned elements like Hezbollah and IRGC-backed militias. And I think, at least in the initial 3 days, we have not necessarily seen signs that these organizations will come to their aid to make it really matter when it comes to trying to achieve regime gains, or they're just incapacitated. And I think that is especially the case for Iran-backed organizations. They just do not have the organizational capacity. They do not have the weaponry. They do not have the personnel that will make a difference. And for Russia, they evacuated a base in Tel Rifat. Recently today, Moscow issued a statement that essentially said and sent this message that they rely on the regime to restore order. So we haven't necessarily seen signals and messages from Russia that indicate that they will provide substantial support to allow them to retake and reclaim these territories.
I mean, Qutaiba, the regional dynamics have changed so much in the last 12 months. Hezbollah is a shadow of its former self after its fighting with Israel. Iran weakened, as we've heard. So this, for those groups those fighting groups in northern Syria, this is a perfect opportunity for them to take.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is the main weakness of the Assad regime, that while when it comes to personnel, Iran has replaced the presence of Hezbollah around Aleppo and Idlib months ago with the Nujaba movement from Iraq, and brought in around 800 Iraqi fighters to replace those positions that Hezbollah fighters were manning. I think the main thing that Iran and the regime cannot really replace is the leadership and the military advisors that Hezbollah lost a lot of, and that Iran has lost a lot of, or kept those who are still alive on the ground, on the battlefield in Lebanon and in Syria on the fronts with Israel. So there is really an important imbalance of power here for Iran, because they cannot really handle all of these fronts at the same time. And definitely the weakening of Hezbollah is playing a huge role here. I think, as Caroline mentioned, the big question is, how can Russia manage this? And for Russia, to be honest, it's not an easy question. For sure, like if we look at the examples of similar countries managing Air Force operations in the region, if we look at the Al Udeid base in Qatar, for example, it's manned by 11,000 servicemen. Russia doesn't have, I think, enough manpower to send at this moment to Syria to man the necessary operations needed to push the rebels back in Aleppo. So there is really a big question: how could Russia push back with Turkey or against the rebels to stop such operation? But also the big question, I think, as Caroline mentioned, is how much the rebels really can hold. I think there is a question of logistics, of manpower as well, because as the front lines really expand, there will definitely be need for additional manpower on the rebel side. Not to doubt that this would stop them. I think one of the other surprising moments we're seeing in the last 3 days is how much support from the populations in northern Aleppo and in Idlib province for this operation. We're seeing young folks in their early 20s who are pushing on those fronts, and we're seeing overall the populations really excited even to move back on the first day that their villages are liberated. So the amount of popular support we're seeing among Syrian communities might be helpful for those rebels in the next weeks and months to come.
Omer, given the logistical challenges, the practical challenges Russia faces, does it have the inclination even to help the Assad regime fight back here?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think the priorities for Russia clearly lie in Ukraine. And as Ukraine is the priority, and Russia even needed North Korean soldiers to maintain the front line in Ukraine and to maintain its advancing, I do highly doubt that Russia will accept to stall its advance in Ukraine in the battlefield for protecting the Assad regime in Syria. And it's very unlikely for the Russians to be able to step up and rescue the Assad regime at that time. And here the Syrian rebels have an important card that they have not played yet. And there is no direct support from Turkey. In 2020, the Turkish drones and the Turkish artillery basically prevented the takeover of Idlib by the Assad regime, Iran and Russia. And if there's a new momentum and new for the Assad regime, the Syrian rebels could still, if it comes to very difficult situations, potentially rely on Turkish direct support that would change the entire battlefield dynamics. So the cards are clearly on the side of the Syrian rebels, and it is very likely that the Assad regime will have to take some steps back.
Caroline, you mentioned the 900 or so US troops in Syria. Trump tried to pull them out last time, the remainder of them. He was eventually, his Secretary of State helped push back. What's the risk of them being pulled out this time and the consequences of that?
I think that looking forward in a Trump administration when it comes to withdrawal from Northeast Syria, up until this point, I think it was very clear that we would likely see an immediate withdrawal from Northeast Syria, especially given the fact that there was a withdrawal timeline announced for Operation Inherent Resolve by the end of 2026. Now, if there is continued conflict and kinetic operations in the northwest of Syria, additionally, if the regime is not able to reconsolidate these gains outside of Aleppo, there could be another reason for U.S. forces to remain in northeast Syria. But looking at the Trump administration's ideological, their vision when it comes to a U.S. forward presence abroad, I think that ultimately they may decide to pull out U.S. forces immediately, especially if there is a sign that a Turkish offensive is imminent. And of course, that they don't believe that there is any reason to put U.S. forces, wedged between SDF units and Turkish forces that would be conducting this offensive. But of course, there is also a very good chance that this administration would keep U.S. forces there, particularly taking and capitalizing on the fact that the regime is losing ground and trying to keep that wedge between Iran-aligned forces and other adversaries in the region.
Qutaiba, you believe the Trump administration would be interested in allowing the US forces to remain there in Syria? In other conflicts, they've shown no great appetite to stay involved, have they?
You're hitting the nail on the head. I think there's definitely a political question there on what does Trump want. I think there are a couple of factors that might have changed Trump's mentality when it comes to withdrawal. I think number one is the serious assassination attempt that Iran tried to conduct against President Trump, that the U.S. Department of Justice has revealed earlier this year. I think this will definitely change the mentality of President Trump, because it's also understood on the security and military level in the U.S. that the U.S. presence in Syria is not only about ISIS. I can even say that it is mainly about Iranian militias and their access into the Levant, Syria, and Lebanon. So there's definitely a need more for that positioning. I think the political decision that President Trump will have to take is whether to withdraw U.S. forces from the borders with Turkey to allow Turkey to create its free zone or basically security zone across the borders with Syria to the depth of 20 or 30 kilometers. That is where the action might happen. But I really doubt that President Trump would want to create the image or would be interested even in pulling U.S. troops completely from northeast Syria.
I mean, Omer, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, has been itching for a long time to clear that space in the northern Syria from the Kurdish-dominated forces. He would relish the opportunity to do that, wouldn't he?
So I think the Turkish president will push forward in this. And here I think the main argument will be that Trump has to make a decision. Either due to the geographical position, if the US withdraws, it will be Iran who will fill this void. If there's an uncoordinated American withdrawal, there's no other force than Iran who can fill this void immediately. So the Trump administration has to make a decision. Either, as Qutaiba just said, they have to stay in and keep Iran at bay, or they withdraw and hand over basically to Iran, or the US works with Turkey. And this is the exact moment the Turkish president will come in and try to reach out to Trump and try to make a deal with him. I think the two presidents have shown in the past that they're quite capable of reaching agreements. And as Trump likes to make bargains and likes to make big deals, the Turkish president would try to say, let's work together, let's work on a coordinated American withdrawal, and let's facilitate a joint roadmap for both states forward in which Turkey can tackle its national security threat and the US can prevent Iran from taking over.
Caroline, Qutaiba touched on this before, but it's worth reminding people that there are 5 million people living under control of different anti-government forces in northern Syria, northwestern Syria, and life there nothing's changed in the last few years. There's been no infrastructure construction. Is there an enthusiasm there, if you like, amongst the people living there to try and resolve this conflict in their favour?
Certainly. I think that even in the last few days, we've seen also a huge displacement crisis, given the fact that the shelling and the conflict has, of course, introduced a new level of insecurity. But when it comes to really returning those displaced populations, particularly diaspora communities that have been away for many years throughout the Syrian civil conflict. civil war. I think that really there's going to be a lot of energy and excitement into trying to revitalize the infrastructure, create new services, governmental services that will really revitalize Aleppo and its countryside. But I think ultimately it's going to really depend on whether opposition forces are able to maintain the gains that they've made in the last 3 days. And of course, there's the question of governance. Who will govern this region, and will they be able to provide the necessary services to really and truly revitalize the infrastructure that's in Aleppo?
Qutaiba, do you think that's even a possibility, that there's any sort of way of unifying these anti-government controlled parts of Syria, in that they may be able to start re-establishing some sort of life there in terms of infrastructure?
I mean, I think there's definitely a base for that. We've seen continuous efforts to really unify at least the military commands. We right now have two main military commands, one in northern Aleppo and one in Idlib. I think there is definitely, we've seen specifically, I think, with HTS, clear improvements in the last 5 years in terms of governance, in terms of administration, in terms of its ability to really govern those areas. I think that model would really be inspiring for other groups to really work with or create their own model that would follow. Because there is definitely, across all of northern Syria, and there's a big question here, of course, that we haven't touched upon, is what would the Kurdish militias or would the Syrian Democratic Forces do, or how would they deal with this in the future? I think there is a model emerging in terms of governance in northwest Syria that is really important to follow. But the biggest question would be, I think, is not really about only in rebels conversations. I think the next big question would be, how could northeast and northwest Syria work together in a way that would maintain security for Turkey, while at the same time increase leverage for forces who are against Assad inside Syria.
Okay, Omer, very briefly, your input on that. How could the future pan out governance-wise in northern and northwestern Syria?
So we will probably see that the Idlib governance structure will be extended to Aleppo city, and that we will see in the future, depending on the Turkish-American agreement, as Qutaiba said, the potential for more discussions in terms of unifying northwest and northeast Syria. But that all depends on what Trump and Erdogan will speak about.
All right. Thanks to all our guests. We're out of time. To Qutaiba Idlbi, to Omer Ozkizilcik, and to Caroline Rose. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.